So whenever I start working with new students, I always like to start with punctuation. Why do I do that? Well, it's because it's functionally the foundation of your whole reading section. First off, you'll just get questions about punctuation in general. The second big reason is that when you get to the harder readings, how they make it hard often is just adding extra dependent clauses and independent clauses with different punctuation. So it makes these sentences feel very jarring because they're so long and complicated. But really all they're doing is just using punctuation. So it's going to be important for you to know how to use the punctuation so you know how to tackle the questions. And last, on the vocab section, they'll give you hints for the vocab words using punctuation, especially colons. So it's going to be important for you to know how do you even use a colon, how to use a dependent clause, and then how to use dashes in order to add information. So here's what I want you to do. Go ahead and get a piece of paper. I want you to break it up into 4 different parts. We're going to go over each of these different kinds of punctuation. This is super SAT specific, and I find that it's the easiest way to get your score up about 100 points if you're scoring anywhere from 1,000 to 1,200. So the first one is going to be the colon. Now, I want you to think to yourself, when do I actually even use a colon? If you thought, I use that for lists, that's actually not the correct way of using it. There's a when and a why. Okay, so the when to use a colon is going to be after a full sentence. And the why is just going to be to elaborate. So let's say you're talking about some sort of subject and you want to say more about that thing that's very specific, you're going to use a colon. Oftentimes people elaborate with lists, so that's where that sort of idea comes from, that you need to add a list. But let's just take a look at some examples. Here's the most basic one. You can have something like, I like reading books. My favorite is Harry Potter. This is elaborating on one of your favorite books. Here's another example. I have 3 favorite colors, red, orange, and yellow. So one important note here that you might have noticed, this has to be a full sentence, but what comes after does not have to be a full sentence. It could literally be anything, but just make sure that right beforehand, you have a full sentence. You'll need to know colons for all 3 levels. Now, a semicolon is really interesting. So it's not often the correct answer on the SAT, but what it does is it separates 2 different sentences. And I'll put a little caveat to that. They have to be related. There's a second use of it, and that's going to be to make punctuated lists. Okay, just a very simple sentence so you can see how it works. But I can write down, I like chocolate. I went to the store to buy more. Easy enough. This is for my first one. My other one is going to be for punctuated lists. Now let's talk about what those might look like. I went to X, Y, and Z. Then I went to A, B, and C. And then I went to I, J, and K. If you notice here, I have a semicolon here and a semicolon here. And I also have the semicolon and to end things. The reason I would use that is because if I didn't use that, it would get a little bit confusing what this comma was referring to. There'd just be too much punctuation that's similar, and so that creates confusion visually. So what you want to do is you actually want to separate it with a semicolon. Next is our dash. Now our dash is interesting. It has 2 uses, but you'll often only be tested on one of them, but you will see the other one being used within the reading. So the first and most common situation you'll see is for parenthetical statements. That's when you add extra information about something you're talking about, but it's not necessary for the sentence. All right, so here's an example. I went fishing on my boat, an old oak vessel with my friends. Now, I'm just adding information about the boat here. I don't necessarily need this information. One thing that you can do with parentheticals is you can always just eliminate them, and your sentence should still work on its own. So I should be able to just do, I went fishing on my boat with my friends. That's totally fine. And the other note here is if you have a parenthetical statement, there's different ways of doing them with punctuation. I could have 2 parentheses here. I could have 2 dashes, or I could have 2 commas, but I can't mix and match. I can't have 1 comma and 1 dash. I can't have 1 parentheses and 1 dash. I can't have 1 comma and 1 parentheses. Now, the second way you might use a dash is exactly like you would use a colon. So if you notice here, I'm pretty much doing the same exact sentence I did earlier, but I'm using a dash instead of a colon. And there's no difference in this case. We use the colon and the dash interchangeably if we're only using 1 dash. Okay, so now the comma. This is the big one. There's 6 different uses of the comma that the SAT will put on their test. Let's just get the most obvious one out of the way. We use them for lists. The second way we use them is often for transition words. This is just words like however, moreover, furthermore. You've seen plenty of these. You usually start a sentence with them. A brief note on this though, you could have the transition word in the beginning, middle, or end of the sentence, and it should have the exact same meaning. So for example, here's one way I could use it. I can put, I went to the store to get groceries, however, they did not have pasta. I use however at the beginning of that first sentence. I could also put it right in the middle of the sentence. I went to the store to get groceries, they, however, did not have pasta. If you notice here, I have to use 2 commas though if I put it in the middle of the sentence. And here's the last way you could do it. I could write down I went to the store to get groceries. They did not have pasta, however. That is a totally fine way of doing it. And the comma goes before the however. It's totally okay to have the however at the end. And all three of these versions function equivalently. They all contrast with that first sentence, that you went to the store, but then you couldn't find what you wanted. You can use it to separate two different adjectives. For example, I can write down here, the cool orange cat. You'll see that there's two adjectives, cool and orange, for cat. For parentheticals, I might see it like this. This is pretty much the exact same sentence I used, but I'm going to use two commas instead of dashes. It says, I went fishing on my boat, an old oak vessel with my friends. I'm just going ahead and adding extra information about this boat, but it's not essential. I can actually remove it. I can put, I went fishing on my boat with my friends, and that is totally fine. And here are the two most common ways that you're going to see on the SAT, especially the hard questions. You're first going to use it to separate an independent and a dependent clause. That dependent clause can come before or after your independent clause. So if you notice here, it says while I was walking, this while I was walking part is a dependent clause. It's going to support what comes after, which is the independent clause. I found $1. So this sentence here could actually, well, this section here could work as a full sentence. That's what makes an independent clause. It works independently. Versus the dependent clause depends on an independent clause. Here's one where it comes after. I won a wrestling trophy, a symbol of my hard work. So I'm talking about a little bit about that wrestling trophy here. Again, I won a wrestling trophy is a full sentence. A symbol of my hard work is not a full sentence. And the last one here is fanboys. So fanboys, what does that stand for? It stands for and, nor, but, or yet so. For the most part, the SAT is going to test you on and but. And sometimes, very rarely so. So this is the one instance where you can use a comma to combine two sentences, but you need a helper word here, and it has to be one of the fanboys. So for example, if I had two sentences like this, very simple, but just to show you, if I had two sentences, I like chocolate, I like candy, I can combine this with fanboys. I can change this to I like chocolate and I like candy, but I need to have that comma and. And I just want to show you one last thing. Of course, I can combine this a little differently. I can combine it like this. I like chocolate and candy. However, if I do that, if you notice, it's no longer two sentences anymore. What comes after this and is not a full sentence, so I actually don't need the comma in order to use the and anymore. In this case here, I like chocolate and I like candy. This is two sentences, so I need to use that comma and for it to work. All right, so those are the 11 different punctuation rules that you'll need to know for the SAT. If you need more help or anything like that, you can always find me on my website or send me an email. My information is in the description. Take care.